Good morning, good afternoon, it's noon, so it's like right in the middle. To you today. Welcome to the Bethel Church Podcast, the podcast that is designed to equip you to connect, love, disciple, serve in your communities, in your families, and just in your lives. I am Josh Consalvo, and alongside me, as always, is the pastor at Bethel Baptist Church here in Westminster, South Carolina. It's Jeromy Dean. How are you, Jeromy?
I'm doing good, Josh. Doing really well. Glad to be back today. Looking forward to just a good conversation, and hope you guys out there listening in and watching or getting through today and having a good day. It's been, I heard the term the other day, quarantine fatigue. I feel it. I don't know if you do or not, but I do. But we'll get through this. Hang in there. Glad you're with us.
Yeah, I think we're like around day 30 something of quarantine. I wish I'd been counting just for the fun of it.
But I know. I do know that this Sunday will be the 7th Sunday that we have not met in person.
Wow.
I know.
Oh, wait, so that means we're more closer to 40 something. That's crazy. That's crazy.
It is. Yes, it is.
But I hope that we're able to look back on this time a year from now, 5 years from now, and remember it fondly in a lot of ways. Obviously, not an ideal situation, but hopefully we can look back at it in some positive lights. I think there's a lot of good that can come out of this, and has.
Absolutely.
So today we're going to do something a little different, and we're going to do this week and next week. I thought it would be fun if we just had a sit-down conversation with Jeromy and just kind of interviewed him. Got his background, his testimony, his story, more or less. The questions that I've kind of laid out for him kind of weave in and out through fun and silly to his testimony, to his ministry, to his family, to everything and anything in between. So we're going to kind of get into that today. Jeromy, are you nervous?
No, I'm not nervous at all. I honestly got the questions ahead of time, so I thought through some of the questions and told you which ones not to ask, so I'm good.
Yeah. It's true. It's true. I can confirm that he did say, yeah, I'm not answering that one. Well, one of them he didn't even tell me not to answer, but I'm sure he doesn't want me to. One of the questions was I was going to ask which one of his children were his favorite.
That's true. I'm not going to. I don't know if they're listening or not. They very well may be. I'm not going to answer that.
So, all right. Well, let's get right into it. Tell me about your childhood, your upbringing. What is kind of the family breakdown, brothers, sisters, mom, dad, the whole thing?
Yeah. So I grew up down in Aiken, South Carolina, right outside of Aiken. Warrenville was the town that I called home and still do. And my parents are there. My family's there. I've got two older brothers, Josh and James, and we get along really well and thankful for it. My parents are great. They had us in church even at the early age. I don't remember not being in church, and so just really thankful for that. So two brothers, no sisters.
Was it intentional that all your names were J names?
Yeah, I suppose so.
I guess it wasn't unintentional.
Yeah, it was. I don't know why they did that. Now it's interesting though. You got Joshua, which is a biblical name. You got James, which was a biblical name, and then you got Jeromy. With an O. It's got an O in it. I don't understand that at all.
I've got to say, it is officially looks normal to me now. I've seen other Jeromy names, around. There's actually a Jeromy playing Survivor this season, and his name pops up on the screen, and now it almost looks weird with an E in it. So
I agreed. I think this is the way it's supposed to be. So,
what is your first? You said you grew up in the church, but what is maybe your first memory of church?
Man, I thought about that question, and the first thing that comes to mind was my baptism. But the second thing that comes to mind is getting in trouble a lot in worship and having to be taken out of the worship center and my mom would take me to the fellowship hall, way down away from the worship center. And I would I had to pick out my switch or whatever for talking and disrupting in worship and things like that. So I remember that a lot. But I remember my baptism. I was young when I was baptized, but I remember the elation, the joy with that moment. And I was 6 years old when that day came. So I remember that fondly. Well,
I kind of knew that you had gotten saved when you were young, so I kind of put these kind of questions in the early section. But this is kind of the big question, what's your testimony? But what do you remember a specific moment or time frame where you did decide to give your heart to the Lord?
Yeah, like I said, I was 6 years old, and my mom for the longest time was my Sunday school teacher. I remember Miss Grace. She was a Sunday school teacher of mine, and just I loved being in church. I loved hearing about the Bible and learned so much through them. And honestly, that's the wonderful thing about the gospel, is that it's so simple that even children can understand who God is and what he's done for them and our need for a savior. And that's exactly what I understood. I mean, I understood that I was a sinner. That was obvious for the number of times I was taken out of the worship center, right? But also I understood that Jesus loved me. And he loved me so much that he died on the cross to forgive me of my sins. And I talked with my mom and my dad about that, and we had those conversations. And my brother was kind of made the decision, my middle brother, about the same time, James. And so I remember, the old school walking down the aisle and telling the pastor. I think Pastor Kidd was our pastor at that time. So that's, I was young, but I understood what you need to know, and that's that we need Jesus.
Did you this isn't a question I had written, but I think it's maybe appropriate. Like, from that moment, did you stop getting in trouble at church afterwards? Like, was there a change?
No, probably not. No, not at all. There was a friend of mine at church that we kind of got in trouble a lot and together. But that's just kind of the nature of being a boy. So
yeah, absolutely, I agree.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So from your childhood, we can kind of move into like teenage years a little bit. But who are some of the biggest influences on your upbringing?
Yeah, certainly. My parents, for sure. Even today, my parents are role models for me in the faith. The way they know the word, the way they teach the word, they're committed to it. I think that's tremendous. And they really, really led me and my brothers well in that growing up, consistently. And I'm glad for that. And so, being involved in church and having a relationship with God was something that was just part of what our family did. It was who we were. But also, I remember two pastors. I mentioned Pastor Kidd. He was pastor when I was young, and I don't remember a whole lot about him because I was so young. But I just remember loving him. I remember the gentleness he had, the love he had for his people. In fact, I actually wanted to be a pastor because of him. That was when I was a kid. That changed a lot over the years. And I can talk about that a little bit more. But I just remember admiring him so much. And then later, when I was a teenager, we were in a different church, and there was a pastor named Bert Walker, and he was very influential for me. He actually served in that church for about a year and a half or so, not very long. But his love for the Lord and his vision for the church just really captured me when I was a teenager. In fact, it was under Pastor Bert Walker that I surrendered to the call of ministry. And so he was pretty significant in that.
Cool. Yeah, and we'll get a little bit more into your call of ministry in a minute. I didn't ask you this. I don't know this answer, so it may not have been till later, but what was your first job?
My first job, like paid professional job, I was in high school, and it was a part-time after-school kind of job, and I was a janitor at the local middle school.
Wow.
Yes. So it was great, though. I enjoyed it. I'd go, and it was not long hours. I spent about 2 hours after school and just clean the hallways, clean the classrooms, and did that for about 2 years. Did
you have like the whole thing, like the janitor jumpsuit, the giant thing of rings?
No, didn't have any of that. I had no authority. With keys come authority. I had none of that. So, but yeah, it was neat. I got paid, and that money I liked that part of it. So
yeah.
I didn't mind what I was doing.
So what else were some hobbies, some things you did as a kid, as a teenager, play sports, etc., stuff like that?
Yeah, I was really into sports. I was into football, still am into football. I played football. Even into high school, I played football. I enjoyed doing that kind of thing. We rode bikes a lot. We grew up on a farm, kind of like around here in Oakway. We grew up on a farm. And so we four-wheelered a lot and did those things as a family and cousins and stuff like that. So spent a lot of time doing that. When I was really into high school, my dad has always had the hobby of doing woodworking and things like that. And so I kind of caught on to that in high school and would spend time in the shop with my dad, making furniture, building stuff out of wood, those kind of things. In fact, like our bedroom suite that we have now, our bed and chest of drawers and things like that, and my dad and I made. So it's pretty cool.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah.
So what was your youth group like? Tell us about your youth group experience and your teenage experience in that way, and how was it formative for you?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That's great. I might spend a little time here. I grew up in small churches. When I say small churches, we had, under 100 or so regular coming to the churches that we attended. And so our youth groups, I didn't really have a staff paid position youth pastor. That was new to me when I got into college, actually. I hadn't really been around many of those or one of those before. And so we were led by volunteers. And I remember the volunteers, they were great. They worked hard to plan events and things for us, but our youth group was pretty small. We had about maybe a dozen at the most in our youth group. And so it was very much a small group kind of focused, doing Sunday school, doing Wednesday night things. But we were fortunate. We had an opportunity to go on some mission trips. We had opportunities to go to some conferences and things like that. I remember being in 8th grade, and the volunteers that were leading at the time had this idea to take us to a youth conference. I had no idea what a youth conference was. Okay. It was planned in Charlotte, North Carolina, at a large church. And the way the volunteers kind of cast this vision to me was that, it's going to be a lot of fun. There's going to be a lot of teenagers there, and from other churches, maybe even from other states, coming in, and it's going to be great. And I was scared. I did not want to go. I had no intentions of going. I didn't want to have any part of it. In my mind's eye, the only reference I could come up with was that it was going to be like a vacation Bible school for a weekend with kids from other states that I didn't know hanging out with me at the table, and we're going to be making like kid crafts and things like that. And so I had no idea what I was in for. But there was a girl, and she invited me to go, and so I went. It's pretty much, that's how youth ministry goes, right? So I went, and honestly, we got there, and it was totally different than I thought. It was a youth conference. It was basically worship and Bible study, good preaching from the Word. And at the beginning of it, the guy who led the conference, he was the lead pastor for it, Louis Giglio. You probably heard of him. I just remember this like it was yesterday. He actually came out and he said, some of you are not here because you wanted to be here. You were forced here. You were convinced you needed to come. Somebody, maybe your parents made you come or whatever, but you didn't want to come. And I felt like in that moment he was talking to me, because that was exactly how I felt. I didn't really want to be there. And he said, but if that's you, I want you to take time before anything starts at the conference, and I just want you to pray and ask God to show up for you this weekend. And then he led in a prayer. And I remember in that moment, I had been struggling. It's middle school. Middle school is a struggling time for everybody, right? But I was kind of struggling in that time, with my faith. I would say that was kind of a crisis of faith that I had. I had some friends that were that didn't believe in God, and they were going in totally different ways and living different lives. And I was kind of torn between those things. And it really was, God, do I really believe the things I've been taught? Do I really believe the things that my parents have shown me? For me, church was boring, right? It wasn't entertaining. It wasn't something I really enjoyed going and being a part of. And so when Louis Giglio made that statement, I did what he said. And I just said, God, if you really are there, and this is really the truth, then show it. Man, I tell you, he showed up for me in my life that weekend in a way that changed me. I recognized that he is the real deal, that what he's called us to, the faith he's called us to, the love that he has for us was real. And I kind of say that I fell in love with God in that moment, and really haven't looked back. When I came back and returned to school and returned to my friends, man, I was passionate about sharing Jesus with people.
That's great.
Yeah.
How did that then influence, I guess, transition into college, and maybe young adulthood? But how did that transition you from youth group to college? Did that influence decisions and where you would go, what you would study, all those things?
Yeah, it sure did. That was my 8th grade year. So right when you're in 8th grade, you're about 14, 15 years old, and so when I got to high school, that's a totally different landscape from middle school and trying to navigate all of that. But I love the Lord, and I wanted to be in the Word. I wanted to be at church. It was during that time period that Pastor Burt Walker was in our church and was kind of leading me through that. And then And then so when I became a sophomore, about 16 years old, I was given the opportunity at church to serve at Vacation Bible School, right? But the church, and I don't know why, I don't know what they were thinking. I don't know who kind of put this bug in their ear, but they asked me to teach a class. And it wasn't just, come in and do hand motions to songs. It wasn't just, walk around with kids or play with kids and do rec. It was, they gave me the responsibility of leading the Bible study class. And there was this other guy, a man who was there with me, and when we came into like a leaders meeting, and he came over, and we knew that I was coupled with him. My first reaction was, okay, what are we going to do? What do you want to do? And he looked at me and he said, "I'm not in charge of this class. You are." And so I loved that. I took that and I was excited for that. And I studied and I prepared and I led that week in the Bible studies. And by the end of that Vacation Bible School week, I was convinced that God had called me to do what I did that week and to do ministry like that. And so I went to Pastor Burt and actually mentioned that to him. And he talked with me about the call to ministry and things like that. And so that's when I answered the call. And I was 16 years old. And I knew from then that that's what God had called me to do, that he called me. Actually, I believe that he called me to student ministry, that he had called me to lead students, to teach students the Bible, and to make disciples that way. And I remember, planning for college. I planned and wanted to go to like North Greenville or Charleston Southern, which was a Baptist college, and study youth ministry and things like that. My dad, in his own wisdom, he shared with me that it's probably best not to go straight into Bible school, but to learn a trade, learn something that you can lean on. If I were to be bivocational, having something that I can do with my, to earn and raise a living, right? So I really resisted that. I did not like the idea of that because I felt like God had called me a different way. I needed to go the way God led me. But I listened to my dad, and I'm thankful that I listened to my dad because I ended up going to Winthrop, which is in Rock Hill, and I studied to be a teacher, and I got that training, but I still believed. This is a long answer to your question, but I still believe that at the end of my college years, even though I had a teaching certificate for public, secondary education, that God would put me in a church and that I'd be leading. But he didn't open that door. I actually ended up teaching at Clover High School for about 7 years. And that first year of teaching, I struggled because I felt like I wasn't doing what God had called me to do. But he showed me in those 7 years that actually I was doing what he called me to do. I had ministry and missions and discipleship and things that could take place on the public campus that I wouldn't have had if I'd gone straight into a church. And so that was very formative for me. I remember when I was at Winthrop, when I was in college, every summer I was doing student ministry at a church, filling in like as a summer intern, things like that. Learned a lot, got a lot of on-hand training for student ministry through that. So that's kind of the walk through that.
So I'm not sure where exactly this fits in the timeline, but we can kind of turn left for a minute and then come back to something that's also very important to your life, and that is how did you meet Amanda?
Yeah. So I dated several girls and things through high school and college, and knew that God wanted me to be married at some point, and I remember I was a junior in college. And after dating some girls, I had just kind of come to the point where, God, this whole dating thing is not working. And I kind of gave up on it. I actually remember praying, in secret to God and saying, God, if you have a girl for me, if there's somebody you want me to marry and spend the rest of my life with, and you're just going to have to just like put them right in front of me, and with a sign on my forehead that says, this is the one, because I'm not looking anymore. Like I'm done. I'm going to focus on other things. And that was, and I remember that being January of my junior year of college. And then my brother got married that June. And when we were at the rehearsal dinner that Friday night before my brother's wedding, I remember standing there in the church and as one of the groomsmen and looking over at the bridesmaids. And there was this one bridesmaid that was stunning. I mean, her smile was just huge and beautiful and mesmerizing. And I looked over and I knew who she was, but I'd never talked to her because she, you know, I was the dorky, nerdy kind of kid in middle school and high school. Right? You asked one of the questions that I was not going to answer was like, what was your most embarrassing, time or moment as your youth and teenage years? Everything was embarrassing for me. Right. And so I knew who she was, but she was in a totally different league from me. And so I remember though kind of getting rid of my fear and kind of getting some courage and some boldness. And I finally, I asked around to see if she was dating anybody, and she wasn't. That's what I heard. And I'm just gonna make this story shorter than it needs to be. But by the end of that weekend, I'd asked her out, and we went out for ice cream after church on that Sunday, and actually we talked student ministry in church the whole 2 hours we spent together, but we both knew that there was something special there. So that's how I met Amanda.
That's awesome. That's very fun. So what? Then I guess at what point? Because these kind of sections kind of interweave. At what point did we, or did you, start at, I guess, Catawba, and where do your kids weave in and kind of go from here?
Yeah, so I'll give you a little timeline on that. So Amanda and I, we dated for about a year and a half. We got married in 2006 when I finished college and she finished, her master's degree, and she knew early on that I was the one she was going to marry. It took me a little longer to kind of come to that conclusion, but I loved her and still love her very much, but she says I'm slow. But we got there and we got married in 2006, and Lillian, our oldest, came along in 2010. And so we were about 26, 27 years old. And when Lillian came along, and we have Lillian, she's 10 now, and Elijah, who is 7. And I taught, like I said a moment ago, Clover High School for about 7 years. It was in 2013 that I had finished doing seminary classes and had put a resume out to see if God was opening a door for vocational ministry, and he did that. And actually, he did that in a couple of ways. Let me back up a step because, in 2000, I guess it was 11 or 12, when we put a resume out for ministry, he called us not to a full-time position like Catawba, but called us to a part-time position down the street where I was bivocational for about 2 years. That church was Bethel Baptist Church, but not this Bethel Baptist Church. And it was a great, great time there. Met great people, still love them, still stay in contact with them, and so grateful for them. And the things that God taught me in that ministry. But it was in 2013 that God called me out of that bivocational position to Catawba Baptist Church in Rock Hill, where I spent 6 years doing student ministry and absolutely loved doing that. And now it was just this past year. I've been here about 9 months now at Bethel in Oakway and serving in this position. So that's pretty fresh.
So what have been, in between or really throughout your whole ministry? I know you wanted to touch on some of like things that were moments that were tests of faith.
Yeah, I did mention one, when I was a teenager, that crisis of faith and really deciding, where am I going to go the way of my friends and the way of the world, or am I going to go God's way? And he showed up, for me in that. And really that just laid a foundation for me in the rest of my life. Another crisis, was that first job. I mentioned that, that crisis of am I doing what God has called me to do by teaching in a high school, or am I supposed to be in a church? And what I learned from that is and it's been true with every move that we've made as a family, that God makes things clear. When there's a decision, there's a choice to be made, there's a direction to go in, God will always make it clear to you what he wants you to do. And until he makes it clear to you, stay where you are and continue letting him use you right where you are, bloom where you're planted kind of idea. And so with every move we've made, my wife and I, we've really followed that until God makes it clear, we're going to stay right here. And so I taught for 7 years until God made it clear that he wanted me to be, bivocational. Now with that decision of being bivocational, we were looking for a full-time position. But what God made clear to us was that he had another step for us to take, and that was to serve bivocationally first. And then he made it clear that we would be full-time. And then he made it clear that we would be here. And so we are constantly waiting on the Lord to give us clear direction. We've had other trials. We've had a lot of trials. We've had a lot of different things. And the reason I wanted you to bring that question up was because, my life is not perfect. I have a lot to be thankful for, a lot that we're blessed in and trusting God with, but we've had our struggles. And it's through those trials and through those struggles that God tests our faith, but he also strengthens our faith, and we come out stronger as we depend more and more on him. I don't have time today, but talking about the time when Amanda had a miscarriage, that was a troubling time for us when we dealt with Elijah. Elijah was born with a lot of issues to overcome physically, and his story is a long story, and it really was a test of faith for me and Amanda, and not a test of faith in the sense of do we believe what we believe, but how it really is, how much are we leaning on God in life and not just on ourselves and what we're able to do on our own.
Yeah, totally. So I think this is important, going from, because you went from teaching to many years of student ministry, like specifically, and then into this role. What were some big takeaways from student ministry, and when did you realize that like you were ready to, I say take the next step, but you know what I mean by that? When did you realize that it was time to, or how did you realize it was time to become a senior pastor and you wanted to look into that?
For the last several years, God has just kind of worked on my heart and the desire to disciple and make disciples and a love for the church. And early on in my ministry, I had a passion and love for students, and I still do, and one of the main reasons is because students have passions and they love what they do. I mean, when students get involved in things and they love it, man, they're going to go all out for it, whether it's sports or if it's academics or church or what. I mean, if you take a group of students on a mission trip that want to be on mission for God, you're going to make a difference in people's lives. And that's the beauty of student ministry. And I absolutely loved it. And I've seen over the last few years how God worked in students' lives and have grown them into leaders today. And I'm glad for that. And so, but in terms of transitioning to where I am now, over the last several years, God has just worked in my heart, kind of a discontent in the sense that I just felt that he gave me this burden for not just students, but for their families, for their parents, for their grandparents, for the church as a whole. And that burden has just kind of grown over the last couple of years. And I've spent a lot of time praying and a lot of time thinking about how we make disciples of Jesus, who make disciples of the churches, following the Holy Spirit and being most effective. And I still burden with those things. But I believe that's a pastor's heart. And so God kind of made that clear to me about this time last year, that he was ready to move me into a different position. It's not like you said, it's not like taking a next step. It's not a move up. It's not a move or anything like that. It's just serving God's kingdom in a different way. And so I'm glad for it. I'm learning a ton. I feel like I'm a rookie and there's a lot that I don't know. But God is good and I'm glad for it.
That's great. Couple of last things as we kind of wrap this up. Some quick hitting questions. Outside of just church world and ministry, things like that, what are some of your passions in life? What are the things that you enjoy doing? We talked about that a little bit earlier.
Yeah. I read that question. I was like, outside of church world, and honestly, there's no such thing for me. And what I mean by that is, and honestly, it's true for every believer, that when we are in the church, it's not the building, it's not just the programs. The church is God's people. And so no matter whether I'm a pastor or I'm just a lay person, being in the church and living this life is church world. And so the things that I love the most are my family. I love God's word. I love the church, and spending time in those things. But also, I guess this is kind of like a hobbies question. Like, what do I do? Yeah. And so I mentioned woodworking. I still love to do that. Get down in the basement now and kind of build some things with table saws and miter saws and stuff. And I enjoy playing golf whenever I get around to it, but I do that maybe like 2 or 3 times a year, and I'm awful, but it's fun. And so I love to read. I love to do some exercise and things like that. But most of the time right now, because my kids are 10 and 7, I just want to spend as much time with them. They're a lot of fun, just playing and learning and exploring things in life. I mean, it's great to be a dad.
Well, it leads us perfectly into my last question, which are, what are the highs and lows of life in the Dean household?
Yeah, the highs are just that. It's just being together in the house. Being together, doing things together, spending time together, living life and exploring life together, growing together. Those are the great things. The lows, really, they're part of it. But there's just, disobedience. We have to, discipline our kids, things like that. That's never fun. We don't ever really enjoy doing those things, and sometimes it's frustrating. Sometimes it's a struggle. Homeschooling, which Amanda's doing a great job with that, but it's a struggle sometimes too. And this quarantine makes it difficult. We'd like to get out and about and do things, but we got cabin fever. And but most of the time, man, God is good. Our kids, I'm fortunate and blessed to have kids that love the Lord, that love what we do and who we are as a family, and we love spending time together.
That's great. So that pretty much, I think, covers it.
That pretty much covers it. Those are great questions. I tell you what, this is probably the most boring podcast we've ever done because we focused on me the whole time. But one of the reasons we did this, and next week, Josh, I think we'll turn the tables and I'll ask you these questions and give you a chance to kind of tell your story. But one thing I want to highlight and emphasize is that this is my story, but God is the hero in my story. I am not the hero. I'm just the character. And God has worked in my life, even from the beginning as he worked in my parents. And my parents laid the foundation of our home. God has just been working in my life and leading me all along the way. And I'm grateful for that. And I'm grateful that the Holy Spirit has opened my eyes to see him at work in me. And I look forward to what he's going to do going from here. But for those of you listening and those of you kind of tuning into this, even if you're tuning in later and this isn't live, I would encourage you to find time to think through your story. Think through how God has worked in your life. Is God really the hero of your story? And find ways to share that with others. Maybe during this time in quarantine, just calling up a neighbor that you haven't talked to in a while, or even just a best friend that maybe you haven't shared these things in a while. Tell them how God is working in your life and what difference it's made. Sharing your testimony is a big deal.
Yeah, and if you don't do any of those things, make a Facebook status. Share, a couple paragraphs or as much as you want. I guess doesn't matter. Like that's an easy way to share your testimony with people. We as human beings are drawn to stories. That's why we watch movies and TV shows and are interested in these kinds of things, because we like stories. That's how we're kind of wired. So, share your story, and people are interested, and that could be an avenue for gospel conversations.
Absolutely.
So I think that about wraps it up for us today. We are so glad for those of you that are able to join us live. And if not, you're watching after the fact or listening after the fact, thank you so much for tuning in. We will be back again next week where, like Jeromy said, I'm going to blabber on about my life, which will be fun because I love to talk about myself. Don't we all, though? All right, that's it for us today. Thank you for joining us, and we will see you Sunday if you want to join us for worship at 10 a.m. 10 a.m. live on Facebook at facebook.com/lovingbethel. And if not, we'll see you again next week.
Thanks.